Welcome to the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum's 2020 lecture series. I'm Jim Ziegler, the Executive Director of the museum. Tonight we're pleased to have Rich Smith discuss the history of the Valley Iron Works. Richard P. Smith, Jr. is Senior Engineer in the Operations Technology Department for ArcelorMittal, Coatesville, Pennsylvania. Rich earned a BS degree in Metallurgical Engineering from Lafayette College, an MS in Engineering Management, and an MS in Materials Engineering, both from Drexel University. He also completed an MS in Mechanical Engineering from Villanova University. Rich is also a registered professional engineer. Rich started his career as a metallurgist with Lucan Steel in Coatesville, PA, after graduating from Lafayette College in 1977. During his 43-year career with Lucan's, Bethlehem, ISG, and ArcelorMittal, he's had various assignments in the quality control, research, development, operations, and engineering departments at the Coatesville and Conshohocken plants, primarily in the melting, casting, and rolling areas. Rich is a Six Sigma black belt and was responsible for Bethlehem's Six Sigma program at the Coatesville and Conshohocken plants. He also taught in the Six Sigma program at Drexel University as an adjunct professor. As a lifelong member of the Association of Iron and Steel Technology, Rich has served as chairman of the Plate Rolling Operations Committee and on the board of directors. He's authored papers in ingot mold design, leveling, and on the history of the iron and steel industry in Pennsylvania. He won the AISE Kelly Award and a Meritorious Award from the Mechanical Working and Steel Processing Conference, both for papers on roller leveling. Rich has done extensive research in the American iron and steel industry from its birth in colonial times. He has also made numerous presentations on the history of iron and steel making in Pennsylvania, as well as the development of the industry in Coatesville. Rich was involved in Cub Scouting in Chester County for 25 years, serving as a Cub Master for over 15 years. He shared his knowledge and enthusiasm by training leaders and youth for 20 years. He's also taught religion classes for 5th through 8th grades for 25 years. Rich is married and has 5 grown children. Please join me in welcoming Rich.
Thank you, Jim. Good evening. This is rather interesting that we're doing this in a virtual mode. When I was a young engineer and learning to do presentations, I was told, look out into the crowd and pretend no one is there and you won't get nervous. Well, tonight I have to look out and pretend there's actually people here. Tonight I'm going to talk about the history of the Valley Iron Works. You might ask, where was the Valley Iron Works? Well, if you traveled Route 82 from the Coatesville bypass into the city of Coatesville, you probably have passed a roof that's peaked up over the guardrail right at the top of the hill before you come down into Coatesville. That roof is the roof of Valley Hall, which was the ironmaster's mansion built in the 1850s. That's the most visible evidence left of the Valley Iron Works, which was located along the Brandywine directly across from the mansion. The Valley Iron Works was built in 1837, and it was known as the Callan Iron Works at that time because it was in Callan Township. It operated, except for a few interruptions, until 1919, or a span of 82 years. For 50 years, it was controlled by 2 branches of the Pennock family. It reached its pinnacle of prosperity in the 1870s and 1880s when it employed 200 men, which was by far the largest local ironworks. It had one of the widest plate mills in the state. It rolled wide iron plates for locomotive steam boilers and for ship hulls. It rolled plates for the City of Peking, which was the largest American steamship ever built, and second only in the world to the British vessel, the Great Eastern. It also rolled plates for the USS Dauphin, which was one of the first 4 iron-hulled ships that the Navy purchased. In 1820, there were 2 rolling mills in the Coatesville area. One was the Federal Slitting Mill, 4 miles south of Coatesville, and the other was the Brandywine Iron Works. Both of these were started by Isaac Pennock. Isaac established the Federal Slitting Mill in 1793. It was located 4 miles south of Coatesville on Buck Run. In 1810, he partnered with Jesse Kersey and bought a 110-acre farm from Moses Coates, who was Jesse's father-in-law. There was a sawmill on the property, which they converted into a rolling and slitting mill and named it the Brandywine Iron Works and Nail Factory. By 1850, there were 8 mills in the Coatesville area. The original 2, and then one at Mortonville. Laura Forge installed a rolling mill in 1825. Samuel Hatfield built one in Wagontown along his grist mill. Hibernia Forge added a rolling mill in 1837. And then the Callan Iron Works, which we will talk about tonight. The Triadelphia Iron Works in 1838, and the Thorndale Iron Works, built in 1847. If you look at the longevity of these 8 mills, you'll see that they varied from anywhere from 41 years for a couple of the local ones to 63 and 72 years, compared to the Callan or the Valley Iron Works, which was in existence for 82 years, and then Lucan's, which is still going strong at 210 years. If you were a visual learner, you might prefer to see a timeline. The Federal Slitting Mill, later called Rogeby, was built in 1793 and burned down in 1865. It was in operation for 72 years. The Laurel Iron Works built a mill in 1825, which ran for 63 years until 1888. Samuel Hatfield's rolling mill, which he called the West Brandywine Iron Works, operated from 1836 until 1880 for 44 years. Hibernia's mill, built in 1837, was shut down in 1878 after 41 years of operation. As I mentioned, the Valley Iron Works, built in 1837, was in operation until 1919, or 82 years. The Viaduct Iron Mill, built under the bridge where the railroad crossed the Brandywine in 1838, operated until 1942 for 104 years. Thorndale Iron, which was the first mill not built on the Brandywine or a waterway because it was operated by steam, was built in 1847 and shut down in 1893, 46 years later. As I mentioned, Lucan's, which is now ArcelorMittal and perhaps soon to be called something else, has been operating continuously for 210 years. Martha Webb Pennock, Isaac's wife, was also an early iron master. She was the mother of Rebecca Lukens, and along with her children inherited the Federal Slitting Mill when Isaac died in 1824. She had the mill rebuilt and named it Rogeby. Together with her children, they sold the mill in 1837. The heirs, her children, included Rebecca Lukens, Sarah Pennock, Jesse Coates and Martha, his wife, James Penrose and Mary Ann, his wife, and George Pennock. The mill was bought by a group of 4 men, and I can only assume that the proceeds of the sale were used to finance the building of the new mill, the Callan Iron Works, with the 7 acres Isaac owned in the area, which was inherited by his daughter Martha and served as a nucleus of the endeavor. Martha Pennock was the daughter of Isaac and Martha Pennock, and she married Jesse Coates, the son of Moses Coates, for whom the city of Coatesville is named after. Jesse Coates, her husband, was a medical doctor. He was born in 1796 and married into the Pennock family in 1824, the year that Isaac passed away. 13 years later, he partnered with George Pennock, his wife's brother, to build the Cain Iron Works. George Webb Pennock was the youngest of the children of Isaac and Martha Webb Pennock. He was born in 1811, and he was only 13 when his father died in 1824. He ran a Rogeby mill at age 22 after his older brother Isaac passed away in 1833. As I mentioned, they sold Rogeby in 1837 and looked to build the new ironworks at Cain. The 1830s saw a rapid growth of the Pennsylvania iron industry. There were protective tariffs that favored the iron industry and generated tremendous profits. As a result, in the decade of the 1830s, there were 77 new blast furnaces built, along with 46 forges, bloomeries, and rolling mills. The Brandywine provided good water power for operating a mill, and it had good transportation opportunities. The Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike, which was opened in 1794, provided good road transportation. And then the Columbia Railroad had just opened in 1834. That spurred a lot of activity. As I mentioned, Samuel Hatfield added a rolling mill alongside his grist mill in Wagontown 2 years later in 1836. Hibernia Forge added a rolling mill in 1837, and the Triadelphia Iron Works was built in 1838. So within 4 years after the railroad came through Coatesville, you had 4 new rolling mills within 2 miles of the railroad. Now, in my research, I've come across a lot of statements that I have found are not exactly true. So I'm going to play Mythbusters. Myth number 1. The Cain Iron Works was built in 1837 by Martha Pennock, Isaac's wife, for her son George and son-in-law Dr. Jesse Coates on the portion of Isaac Pennock's real estate which had been selected as her share of Isaac's estate by Dr. Coates' wife, Martha Webb Pennock Coates. Now, I've read this in Stuart Houston's History of Iron Industry in Chester County in 1943 and several other places. Now for the facts. Going through land deeds, it's revealed that 7 acres did come from Isaac Pennock's estate, but 58 acres were purchased jointly by Dr. Coates and George Pennock, 20 acres were bought outright by George Pennock, and another 5 acres, the land on which the mill was actually built, was purchased by Dr. Coates for a total of 90 acres. Myth number 2. Cain was built in 1847 by Dr. Jesse Coates and George Pennock, but never operated by them, being sold to Martha Pennock, wife of George Pennock, at a signee sale before they were completed. This came out of the Coatesville Weekly Times in 1893. The facts. The mill started construction in 1837, but there were completions. The completion was delayed by the Panic of 1837, which was a recession. It was completed in 1838. It was sold to Martha Pennock, wife of Isaac Pennock, at a sheriff's sale for $13,500 in 1842. Myth number 3. Cain Iron Works was never operated by either George Pennock or Dr. Coates, but was leased. This was in Houston and the Coatesville Weekly Times. The fact, Examination of tax records revealed that George Pennock and Dr. Coates operated the ironworks in 1838 and 1839. The rolling mill and 60 acres of land was assessed at $1,000 in the name of Pennock and Coates in 1838 and Coates and Pennock in 1839. The mill was leased to Francis Park and John Park from 1844 to 1848. And finally, myth number 4. Mrs. Pennock sold the Callan Iron Works to Joseph and Charles Pennock in 1853, coming from the Coatesville Weekly Times. The fact is Martha Pennock died in 1844. Joseph and Charles Pennock purchased the Callan Iron Works for $17,000 at a sale ordered by the Orphans Court in 1853 to settle Martha's estate. Immediately upon start of construction, the Callan Iron Works faced a number of challenges. The Panic of 1837 was a nationwide recession, and it delayed the startup of the ironworks by at least a year. Rebecca Lukens wrote in her journal, "All is paralyzed. Business is at a stand. I have even forbidden my agents to sell." The panic caused the cessation of the extensive works about to have been established at the Brandywine, less than a mile from the village. We hope to see them completed ere another summer goes by. This was taken from the Coatesville Star in 1838. Dr. Coates dissolved his partnership with George Pennock in 1839. Jesse and Martha Coates conveyed 3 parcels of land to George Pennock for a sum of $6,567, containing 5 acres that he bought outright, the 7 acres Martha inherited from Isaac, and the 58 acres that he had bought jointly with George. These challenges continued into the 1840s. The U.S. Census of 1840 showed that the Callan Iron Works was up and running in that year. It employed 12 men and produced 200 tons of sheet iron. It had the same number of men but produced half the tons of the other 6 local ironworks. And it produced sheet iron, not boilerplate. Sheet iron was of lesser value and demanded a lower price. If you compare the ironworks that were active from data gathered in 1841, you'll see that just about all of the local works employed between 10 and 12 men. They all made boilerplate except for Laura that made sheet iron and Callan that made sheet iron. And they all produced about 400 tons of plate compared to only 200 tons for Callan. These facts may have resulted in financial troubles because the Callan Iron Works was sold at a sheriff's sale in April in 1842. The mill, along with 65 acres of land and a row of tenant houses, was sold as a result of a suit Dr. Coates brought against his brother-in-law, George Pennock. That must have made for a nice Thanksgiving table discussion. It was bought at the sheriff's sale by George's mother, Martha, for $13,500. George still owed money, and out of that $13,500, he owed $500 of the $1,000 that was due on the 5-acre tract, and $1,670 of the $4,600 for the 58-acre tract that he purchased with Dr. Coates. And it turns out, just about the same time, he lost a 400-acre farm and a 100-acre farm to sheriff sales. I guess it's safe to say that he was not financially astute. If you look at a timeline, for the first 5 years of its existence, from 1837 to 1842, the mill was owned by George Pennock and Jesse Coates. Now, Martha Pennock, George's mother who bought the mill at the sheriff's sale, passed away 2 years later. The tax records for 1844 show Martha Pennock as the owner and Francis and John Park as ironmasters. It was leased to Francis Park and John Park from 1844 until 1848. It had 2 rolling mills, both powered by water. In 1847, the records show 8 stone houses and 1 frame house that were tenant houses built for the workers. The 1849 data shows 2 mills, 2 puddling furnaces which had been added, 42 men, and a capacity of 1,400 tons, but the tax records show Francis and John Park crossed off and Mary Pennock listed. No taxes were assessed, indicating there was no income, so at this point, Callan Iron Works lies idle. In 1850, the ironmasters had a convention in Philadelphia, and they collected data of all the iron mills in Pennsylvania. For the local area, you can see the data shows that everyone was making boilerplate at this time. Employment had increased. Callan was operating with 42 men, producing 600 tons a year of bar and 800 tons of boiler and flue plate. The other mills were producing mostly less if they had 1 mill. Several mills had 2 rolling mills, Triadelphia, and they only produced 550 tons. But West Brandywine with 2 mills was producing 1,000 tons. The tax records for 1850 to 1852 no longer list Francis and John Park. They had left the mill, and the mill sat idle. The record shows Martha Pennock's estate as the owners, and the fact that no taxes were assessed confirms that it produced no income because there was no production. The mill sat idle due to litigation over Martha Pennock's estate. In 1852 and 1853, the records list David McCunkie as the agent for Martha's estate, and again, no tax was assessed. The heirs could not decide how to settle the estate, so David McCunkie filed a petition to the Orphans Court that settled estates to sell the ironworks to generate money. I assume the money was easier to distribute than real estate. So the mill was offered for sale by order of the Orphans Court in 1853 to settle the estate of Martha Pennock. So in 1853 ended the Martha Pennock era that ran for 11 years. At the sheriff's auction, the mill was bought by Charles and Joseph Pennock and Augustus Boyd for $17,000 in November of 1853. Charles was 28 years old and his brother was 26. The name was changed to Valley Iron Works because in 1852 Valley Township was formed and the mill found itself in the midst of Valley Township. The mill was rebuilt after a long period of inactivity and enlarged. A larger rolling mill was put in. The operations resumed in late 1854, just long enough to produce 124 tons of plate. This increased to 700 tons in 1855 and to 900 tons in 1856. The mill was enlarged again in 1857 and a second rolling mill was installed. Charles Pennock, one of the new owners, was born in 1825. At age 24, he ran the Laurel Iron Works for 3 years, from 1851 to 1853, with his younger brother Joseph. They were great-grandnephews of Isaac Pennock. Their maternal great-grandfather, Jesse Pennock, was Isaac's brother. Laura was taken over by James Penrose, who was the husband of Mary Ann Pennock, Isaac's daughter and Rebecca Lucan's sister. Joseph Pennock was born in 1827. He's the one that built the ironmaster's mansion across from the mill in the 1850s. He handled the financial side of the business. And as I mentioned at the opening, Valley Hall, the ironmaster's mansion, is the roof line that peeks over the guardrail of Route 82 between the bypass and Coatesville. And that's the most visible evidence left today of the Valley Iron Works. We have some rolling mill data from 1856, and it shows that most of the mills were still powered by water. The viaduct had two mills, one was powered by water and one by steam, and the Thorndale Iron Works had two mills, both powered by steam. They all produced boilerplate and produced between 1,065 tons, 1,179 tons, down to a low of 220 tons at Hibernia. And Valley produced 900 tons. So the Pennocks were making progress with productivity. In the 1860s, the Civil War placed incredible demands on the iron industry, and all of the local mills prospered. In 1862, the total production of the 8 local mills totaled 2,400 tons. That output increased more than threefold to 8,500 tons in 1864. Valley produced 567 tons in 1862 and 1,444 tons in 1864. The only mills that produced more than that was the Viaduct Mill at 2,350 tons and Lucan's just slightly more at 1,487 tons. In 1860, the third partner, Augustus Boyd, withdrew from the firm, and then Valley Iron became a family business. The Pennocks used profits generated during the war to expand again. At the time, they had 2 mills that were both 72 inches wide. In 1865, they built an 86 wide, 2-high rolling mill that was capable of rolling plates 80 inches wide. At the time, it was one of the widest mills in the country. They also built tenement houses. In 1867, they built 16, followed by 10 more in 1869. They also built a steel bridge across the Brandywine at the mill to an area called Cat Swamp and the station of Valley on the Wilmington and Reading railroads. In 1873, there was another recession called the Panic of 1873, and it affected the iron industry and all of the local mills. The lack of business caused the Pennocks to reduce the wages of their puddlers who made iron by 50 cents per ton. That caused the peddlers to go on strike and caused some strife at the local mill. But throughout the recession, Valley Iron was one of the few mills that never had to stop operations completely during this recession. In 1874, the market rebounded, mostly driven by shipbuilding along the Delaware River from Wilmington to Philadelphia. There was a large demand for wide plates rolled on Valley's mills because they were the widest. And during this period of time, Valley Iron supplied iron plates for the ship City of Peking. This was a large steamship that was launched in 1874. It was built in Chester, Pennsylvania by the John Roach shipyards. It was the largest American steamship ever built and was second in the world only to the British vessel called Great Eastern. In 1873, a hand-colored lithograph map of Valley Township was produced. If you look closely, you can see the Valley Iron Works. If you blow it up, you can see it a little bit better. And if you enlarge it even more, you can see that the owners of the land and the houses are identified. If you look closely, you'll find that most of the houses in Rock Run were owned by either the iron works or the woolen mills in the area. C. Pennock and Company owned 6 houses. Steele and Worth, who owned the Viaduct Iron Works owned 3 houses, the Kenworthy Woolen Mill owned 3, and the Greenwood Woolen Mill owned another 3. In addition, the C.E. Pennock Company purchased 2 large pieces of farmland on either side of the Brandywine. Now, there's some speculation that they might have bought some of this land because iron ore was discovered in West Callan Township, and they might have bought it for that purpose. There's a company in Philadelphia called Hexamer that produced general surveys. They documented industrial sites around Philadelphia during a time period from 1865 to 1896. And they provided detailed information about buildings for fire insurance. They also included some information about the machinery contained in the buildings. They produced one for C.E. Pennock and Company in 1876. And it shows the location of the puddling furnaces, the heating furnaces, the rolling mills, and the shipping building. So you can see a little bit of the detail inside the building. They also have sketches of the outside of the building. And the list of machinery includes 4 rolling mills. One was 110 inches wide, powered by a 450 horsepower steam engine, and it was considered to be the largest rolling mill in the country. The total capacity of the mill at this time was 7,000 tons per year. It turns out that they rolled plates for Dr. Houston at Lucan's that could not be rolled on his 84-inch wide mill. The local iron mills sold their plate through agents who lived in the big cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and some of them used the same agent. The agent would send a list of materials to the mills. If Dr. Houston couldn't provide the wide plates, the Pennocks would roll it for him. The agents knew this, and sometimes they would even split up the orders and just go ahead and send the wide plates right to the Valley Iron Works. Now, if you look really close at this, you'll see that there was a water closet located outside of the building over top of the tail race. The tail race dumped water into the Brandywine that turned the water wheel. The mill pond captured the water. The dam raised it so it had more potential energy. The water was brought into the mill through the head race, turned the water wheel, and after it provided the energy, went back to the Brandywine through the tail race. The location of the water closet indicates that they might have been dumping more than just water back into the Brandywine. Charles Pennock was also active in politics in the 1880s. In 1881, he protested the importation of iron plates used in the manufacturing of boilers. In 1881, there was a sign posted at the ironworks announcing that the mills would be closed on Thanksgiving Day, but it went on to say that the wages of the men will be paid the same as though they had worked. This may have been the first paid holiday in the United States. At the time, they employed 200 men, compared to 100 at Lucan's and 150 at the Viaduct Iron Works. In 1882, William Pennock, Charles's son, and John Pennock, the son of Joseph, joined the firm. They rolled their first steel plates in October of 1886, and another big order that got a lot of publicity was iron plates for the USS Dauphin. The USS Dauphin was launched in 1884. It was also built in Chester, PA by the John Roach shipyards. It was part of the new Navy. It was one of the first 4 iron-hulled vessels that the Navy ordered. It was a dispatch vessel. It was a courier for messages between ships before the age of radio communications. And later in its life, it served as a presidential yacht for Chester Arthur. A map of Valley Township in 1883 shows a large mill pond that was associated with the rolling mill. It was considered to be the largest mill pond in Chester County and certainly the largest in the Brandywine area. Later it became known as Kirch's Dam, and it was lined with boathouses and vacation homes. Another company called Sanborn Paris was in the business of making maps of cities. They made several maps of Coatesville and the surrounding area every couple years, starting around 1886. A comparison of this to the Hexamer map of 1876 showed that there were very few changes in the mill. One peddling furnace was added for a total of 5 now, but they still operated 4 heating furnaces and 4 rolling mills. 2 of them were 72 inches wide, 1 was 96 inches wide, and then there was a big 110-inch wide mill. But the total capacity was still listed at 7,000 tons. In the 1880s, there were developments that changed the iron industry. There was a growing market for steel plates due to the higher strength of steel. There was increasing demand for wider plates for both boilers and ships because that reduced the number of seams required to fabricate the vessels or the boilers. Seams were failure points, and the boilers typically failed at the seams. Valley Iron certainly had the wide mills, but the old mills were not strong enough to roll steel. In 1886, their puddlers demanded a 20% increase in pay. The Pennocks refused to pay it. The puddlers went on strike and stayed out on strike for 5 weeks, eventually earning a 50-cent per ton increase from $3.50 a ton to $4 a ton. But then Joseph Pennock died unexpectedly in 1887 and disaster struck. Valley Iron Works closed within 6 weeks. During the first 34 years of operation, Charles Pennock ran the mill and Joseph looked after the financial side of the business. He negotiated the sales contract and took care of the loans. When he died unexpectedly on July 11, 1887, Charles found that the finances were in disarray. It was revealed that Joseph had borrowed heavily in the past 2 years to keep the mill operating. The debts of the firm totaled over $250,000. A lot of it was owed to a company by the name of Robert Hare Powell and Company, which was the oldest and largest firm in the United States. They summoned Charles to their office in Philadelphia and showed him records that indicated that he owed them $203,000. Charles was forced into assignment, which was a form of bankruptcy back then, in late August. And this had a domino effect that forced the Powell Company into assignment or bankruptcy. There was a lot of allegations going back and forth between the two firms. Charles had made an assignment to Augustus Boyd, who was the partner that they started the business with from 1853 to 1860. When Charles was confronted with the information from Powell and Company, he had given them a promissory note for $203,000, which he thought they would only use if they absolutely needed it while he got his affairs in order. They tried to cash it right away, which he thought was unfair. He did not think that they should be paid ahead of any other creditors. When he found out they were going to cash it in, he went into assignment. Assignment meant that he turned the business over to a trustee, in this case Augustus Boyd, who would impartially decide who would get paid in what order so that everyone was treated fairly. At the time, the estimated worth of the mill was between $300,000 and $400,000 against the liabilities of $250,000. They couldn't work out any agreements, so the Valley Iron Works was sold at a public auction on February 16th of 1888. It included 140 acres of land and 42 tenement houses. At the auction, the mill was bought by William Kurtz for $56,500, which was well below the estimated worth of the mill. It is said that Joseph Pennock's widow mentioned that as she was leaving, that she had entered Valley Hall a happy bride, but left it a heartbroken widow. So looking at the timeline from 1853 to 1888, when the mill was sold, covered the 35 years that Charles and Joseph Pennock operated the mill. The new owner, William Kurtz, was a banker from Philadelphia. He had organized the firm of W. Kurtz and Sons just to operate the mill. He appointed his son Henry as manager of the ironworks. The mill was shut down while they were enlarged and remodeled for the manufacture of steel as well as iron. When it came back up, they said they had a capacity of 20,000 tons per year. During this time, it was reported that a new large rolling mill had been ordered in January of 1889, but it was never purchased. The rolling mills, the same 4 rolling mills, started up in May of 1889. In March of 1889, they made some improvements. A new railroad bridge was built across the Brandywine, and in October, the old puddle mill was torn down and replaced with a new puddle mill. The dam across the Brandywine that created the pond was strengthened by reinforcing the front wall. The mill pond became a major recreation area, including fishing, boating, and vacation homes. The mill pond was 1 mile long and 1/4 mile wide, and it was lined with boathouses and vacation homes owned by people as far away as New York. Another hexamer survey was done in 1890 when Kurtz owned a mill. As you can see, the buildings are larger and 3 big mill bays are the same length. The shipping building or area was gone. And that sketch agrees with a photograph that was taken by the Coatesville Board of Trade in a publication that they put out in 1891. This is the northwest corner looking toward the southeast at the 3 mills. This is the original mill, and you can barely see the ironmaster's mansion, Valley Hall, through the trees and smoke on the hillside. Unfortunately, orders dried up in the fall of 1893 to the point where the mill was forced to shut down on January 1st, 1894. It resulted in 150 employees losing their jobs, and the mill sat idle for 8 years after that. Reportedly, in 1901, there was a company that obtained a charter to run the mill called the Coatesville Iron and Steel Company, but this never materialized. It generated a lot of interest in the local papers, but it never came to fruition. The Kurtz sold the mill in September 1902 to the Saxton Furnace Company. The Sanborn Paris Company produced maps of Coatesville and the area in 1891 and 1896. And if you put them side by side, you'll see that there was virtually no change in the Valley Iron Works between those 2 years, 2 maps. The mill sat idle, and you can see it was starting to fall into disrepair in this picture taken in 1898. So we could go back to the timeline and fill in from 1888 when Kurtz bought the mill until 1902 when it was sold. For those 14 years, the mill was idle for 7 or 8 years. Now, recently I've done a lot of research into the Saxton Furnace Company, and I found out some very interesting information. The 2 blast furnaces that were owned by the Saxton Furnace Company were built in the 1880s by Robert Hare Powell Company, the company that forced the Valley Iron Works into bankruptcy. They operated the firm under the name Powelton furnaces. In 1889 or 1890, these furnaces were idled, and it makes me wonder if it was due to the financial bankruptcy caused by the Pennocks. In 1894, William Kurtz shows up as the attorney for the bondholders going after the debts of the Poweltons, or the Powell Company. In 1896, William Kurtz becomes the president, and his son, William B. Kurtz, is the secretary and treasurer of a newly formed company called the Saxton Furnace Company. This all goes on while Henry is back in Coatesville babysitting the idled Valley Iron Works. In 1898, the Saxton Furnace Company blast furnaces are listed as idle for 7 years. Now, it could be that they bought the blast furnaces for a source of iron to provide iron for the mill, but it appears that they never produced any for the mill. The Robert Powell Company did a lot of business with the Pennocks over the course of 30 years, and they probably supplied them with iron from these furnaces before both of them went bankrupt. One furnace apparently operated in 1901, and then the whole enterprise failed in December of 1903. It turns out that the Saxton Furnace Company may not have operated the Valley Iron Works at all in the 4 years that they owned them. After failing in 1903, the mill was sold at an auction in Philadelphia in 1906. It was bought by a third party who paid over $213,000 for the blast furnaces and the mill. And then they were split up. Congressman James Thropp bought the 2 blast furnaces. He already owned the Everett furnace, another blast furnace in Bedford County, about 10 miles from the Saxton furnaces. And the Valley Iron Works was purchased by the Worth brothers for just over $55,000. The purchase included 63 tenement houses, which brought the number of houses the Worth brothers owned up to almost 100. Going back to the timeline, we fill in from 1902 to 1906 as the Saxton Furnace era, and conclude that the mill was idle for the entire time that they owned the facility. The Worth brothers considered the rolling mill to be obsolete and unsuited for meeting the demands of rolling steel in the plate market. The mill was completely revamped. Instead of a plate mill, they converted it and made it part of the Viaduct Iron Works, which they owned, and included the Viaduct Forge and the Viaduct Tube mills. It was converted to the manufacturing of charcoal, iron scalp, and sheet used to produce tubes at the Viaduct plant. This was similar to what the Parksburg Iron Company was doing. The conversion took a little over 9 months. The Worth brothers added a bloomery with 10 forge fires and a large steam hammer. The 3 plate mills were converted into 2 scalp mills and 1 sheet mill. The big mills, the 96 wide and the 110-inch mill, were cut down to 54-inch wide mills. The 72-inch wide mill was changed to a sheet mill, and the small 72-inch wide mill with the smaller 18-inch diameter rolls was converted to a muck bar mill. And then the whole facility was restarted in June of 1907. Let's take a look at how iron tubes were produced. It started out with a forge fire, which was just a small open hearth furnace fueled by charcoal. The raw materials used to make iron could be iron ore, pig iron, wrought iron, scrap, or steel. The charcoal and the setup wasn't hot enough to melt the iron, but the impurities were oxidized out of the raw materials. Iron droplets settled down to the bottom along with slag and formed a sponge of pure iron with the slag entrapped inside of it. This sponge-like material was taken over to a large steam hammer and shaped, or shingled as it was called, under the heavy drop hammer to form a bloom that measured 6 inches by 6 inches by 30 inches and weighed about 300 pounds. After shingling, these blooms were reheated in a charcoal-fired furnace and rolled into bars about 7 inches wide and 3/4 of an inch thick. You can see the bar mill had grooves in it. Each groove was a different width to produce bars of different widths. The most common was 7 inches, but they could produce bars of various widths. These bars were then sheared into smaller, equal lengths and piled or stacked together to increase the piece weight to roll a plate weighing more than they could get out of a 300-pound bloom. The piles were held together with iron wires and then charged into a charcoal heating furnace. They were rolled on the mill to scalp plates, and the heat and the pressure from the rolling operation welded the iron together. Sometimes a drop hammer was also used to weld the piles together. Now, iron is much easier to weld together than steel. Steel forms an oxide on the surface that prevents the material from bonding to each other, but iron doesn't oxidize as easily, and it's almost like silly putty where it can be pounded into one shape from a composite of several layers. After the plate was rolled, it's cropped to length, sheared into strips with a little bit extra width for the lap weld. The scalp is inspected very carefully to make sure there's no defects that could cause failure in the tubes during service. The strip edges are beveled, and then the strips are heated to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and pulled through a die and over a mandrel to form a cylindrical shape of the tube. Then the tubes are heated up to 2,700 degrees, which is called a welding heat, and welded over a mandrel held on the end of the rod between the fast-moving rolls called welding rolls and the tube. The mandrel moves through the tube with the rolls, and the rolls press the iron lap together, sealing it up in a weld. The tubes then go across the cooling table, and a person on the side measures each tube for both size and diameter. The tubes are then cut to the ordered length by a saw, a large circular saw, and the crop ends are tested to make sure that the weld strength is adequate. Every tube was hydrostatically tested at high pressure to make sure that it would not fail during service. Sanborn Paris produced another map in 1909, and looking at this, you can see that the old mill that was in the northeast corner of the property is gone. The head race is cut off because there was no water power. Everything was operated by steam. And the south end of the mill has been expanded. Now, the forge fires were extinguished in 1913. They operated for a short time in 1915, but they weren't generating much money because the industry was moving from iron to steel tubes. So the Worth brothers sold out to Midville in October 1915. They sold all of their operations in Coatesville, including the tube works at the Viaduct and the Valley Mill. Midville only operated the mill for a short time, and the Valley Iron Works was finally shut down and then completely dismantled 4 years later in 1919. So looking at the timeline, the Worth brothers owned it and operated it from 1906 to 1915. But it fell into disrepair under the Midville ownership, and by 1919 it was in pretty bad shape. And on our timeline, the last 4 years under Midville took it up to the point where the mill was completely dismantled. If you go up to where the mill was, there's only a few remnants that still exist that indicate something went on in that area. 3 years ago, I took some pictures of the railroad trestles that carried the track from the Wilmington and Reading Railroad across the Brandywine onto the premises of the Valley Iron Works. The concrete piers are still in the Brandywine. And you can also see the exit of the tail race, where the tail race came from the mill water wheel and emptied back into the Brandywine. I found this picture from 1840 of a book called Along the Brandywine, and it showed these tenement houses. They still exist. I took this picture last week, and you can still see it's the exact same buildings. The ironmaster's house, Valley Hall, still sits rather regally up on a hill overlooking the area where the mill used to be. And those boathouses, well, they are still around. When the dam broke in the 1830s and the mill pond was gone, a lot of these houses were moved up to the area catty corner from Turkey Hill at the intersection of 340 and 82. All of them have been added on to over the years because they started out so small, but you can see the small bungalows that are the original part of the houses. And all these houses came from the area around the mill pond. And that mill pond site now is the home of the Marriott Courtyard that was built a few years ago. All that area has been filled in over the years and now is home to this large hotel. So in summary, the Valley Mill was in existence for 82 years under 7 different owners and operators. For 50 years, it was controlled by 2 branches of the Pennock family. It reached its pinnacle of prosperity in the 1870s and the 1880s, when it employed 200 men and was by far the largest local ironworks. It had one of the widest plate mills in the state and at one time in the country. It rolled wide iron plates for locomotive steam boilers and ship hulls, but it couldn't make the transition to steel. It struggled under subsequent owners following the failure of the C.E. Pennock and Company in 1887. It had a bit of a transformation as a tube producer under the Worth brothers, which extended its existence for 13 years. And today there are only a few visual remnants that serve as reminders of its location and importance to the iron industry in the area around Coatesville. Thank you for your attention.